Good evening, and welcome to Quiet Victorian Nights. Before we begin, take a slow, comfortable breath and allow the day to gently drift away. There is nowhere else you need to be, and nothing that cannot wait until morning. Tonight, we'll wander into a quieter world, where warm firelight glows behind old cottage windows, the village clock marks the passing hours, and life unfolds at a gentler pace than our own. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let the story carry you peacefully into the night. Now, let us begin. The autumn of 1894 arrived quietly over the city of Bath, not with violent winds or sudden storms, but with the gentle certainty of a season that had always known exactly when to return. Each morning, a pale veil of mist drifted slowly above the River Avon before settling among the honey-coloured Georgian terraces, softening every chimney, every iron railing, every church spire, until the city seemed less a place built of stone than a memory painted in fading gold. The chestnut trees lining the crescent had already surrendered half their leaves, which gathered along the pavements in damp bronze drifts, and every passing carriage carried with it the faint scent of wet leather, horse chestnuts, and distant coal smoke that belonged only to English autumns. Margaret Ellison had grown accustomed to watching these mornings from the drawing-room window of the modest townhouse where she had lived since her marriage more than 30 years before. It had once been a room filled with conversation. Her husband, Professor Arthur Ellison, had rarely allowed silence to linger for long. Even while reading, he had possessed the pleasant habit of looking up suddenly from a book to share an unexpected thought about Roman history, a line from Milton, or some amusing observation made by one of his students. His voice had always moved gently through the room, blending with the ticking of the walnut clock upon the mantelpiece and the soft crackling of the fire, until Margaret could scarcely remember a day when the house had felt entirely still. Now the fire burned lower than it once had, more from habit than necessity, and the chair opposite her own remained untouched, except for the careful dusting of the maid each Thursday morning. Arthur's spectacles still rested inside the top drawer of his writing desk, exactly where he had placed them on the evening before his final illness. His fountain pen, cleaned and polished by Margaret every few weeks, without quite knowing why, lay beside a folded sheet of unfinished lecture notes, whose elegant handwriting broke off in the middle of a sentence, as though the thought itself had simply wandered somewhere beyond the reach of ink. For nearly 2 years after his death, Margaret had continued to live according to the quiet routines they had shared together. She rose at 7. She prepared tea in the blue Staffordshire pot Arthur had bought during their silver wedding anniversary. She watered the ivy that climbed the rear garden wall, although it hardly needed watering in England. She visited the circulating library each Wednesday, attended morning service every Sunday, and wrote dutiful letters to her married daughter Charlotte, who lived in Bristol with her husband and 2 lively boys. Nothing in those routines was unhappy, yet neither did any of them ask anything of her. The days unfolded with such gentle sameness that one week settled upon another until entire months passed almost unnoticed, like pages quietly turning themselves in a forgotten book. It was during one such morning, while the rain traced slow silver lines upon the window panes and the kettle murmured softly upon the hob, that the solicitor's letter arrived. Its envelope was heavier than ordinary correspondence, sealed with dark green wax, bearing a crest Margaret did not recognize. She turned it over once before opening it with the small ivory letter knife Arthur had inherited from his father, noticing that the handwriting upon the front possessed the measured confidence of someone who still believed in proper penmanship and good paper. The letter informed her, in language both formal and unexpectedly kind, that Miss Agnes Fairchild of Ashcombe, Yorkshire, had passed away peacefully some weeks earlier, and, according to the terms of her will, had named Margaret Ellison as the sole beneficiary of her tailoring establishment, together with its residence, workshop, furnishings, and all accompanying property. Margaret read the paragraph twice before lowering the paper into her lap. Agnes Fairchild. The name stirred something distant rather than immediate, like the faint fragrance of lavender discovered unexpectedly inside an old wardrobe. She closed her eyes and searched carefully through the long corridors of memory until, little by little, an image emerged. She was perhaps 9 years old again, standing beside her mother during a summer wedding in Oxfordshire. There had been laughter beneath white canvas tents, tables crowded with strawberries and sponge cakes, and among the guests, a young woman with chestnut hair pinned beneath a modest straw bonnet, patiently repairing the torn sleeve of an impatient little boy before joining the wedding breakfast, as though such interruptions belonged naturally to celebrations. Margaret remembered almost nothing else about her except the remarkable calm of her hands and the curious little silver thimble she wore upon one finger, even while speaking with relatives. She had never seen Agnes again. Life, as it so often does, had quietly carried each of them in different directions. Margaret had married, moved to Bath, devoted herself to Arthur's academic world, and later to the raising of their daughter. Agnes had remained little more than a name occasionally mentioned by elderly aunts during Christmas correspondence. Someone who, it was said, had inherited a tailoring shop in a northern village and never felt inclined to leave it. What puzzled Margaret was not merely the inheritance itself, but the impossibility of it. They were scarcely more than distant cousins, connected through branches of the family tree that had long since ceased to touch. Surely Agnes must have known neighbours, apprentices, old friends or parish acquaintances far better suited to inherit an entire business than a widow who had never threaded a sewing needle for anything more ambitious than replacing missing buttons. Only after reaching the final page did Margaret notice a second envelope folded beneath the solicitor's papers. It contained a single sheet written in Agnes's own hand. The handwriting leaned gently forward, graceful without ornament, every line steady, despite what must have been written during the final weeks of illness. It said only, "Dear Margaret, if this letter has reached you, then my own work has come to its proper end. I ask only one thing of you. When winter comes to Ashcombe, please do not change anything until you have seen one whole season with your own eyes. Afterwards, you may decide as you think best. With affection, Agnes Fairchild." There were no explanations, no reasons, no requests beyond that single sentence. Margaret remained seated beside the rain-softened window long after the letter had slipped quietly into her lap. Outside, the church bells of St. Michael's marked the passing of another ordinary hour, while the last leaves of the sycamores drifted lazily across the wet pavement below. Somewhere in the neighbouring houses, doors opened and closed, children laughed on their way home from lessons, and a milk cart rattled slowly along the cobbled street. Life continued with its familiar rhythm, entirely unaware that within the quiet drawing room of number 12, a woman who had believed the meaningful chapters of her own life already finished had just been handed the first page of another. It was not excitement she felt, nor even curiosity alone. Those belonged to younger people setting out toward futures they imagined could still surprise them. What Margaret experienced was gentler than either, and perhaps deeper. It resembled the feeling of hearing one's own name spoken unexpectedly across a crowded room after many years of silence, not loudly, not urgently, but with such unmistakable familiarity that one could not help turning to see who had remembered. By the following morning, before she had fully explained the decision even to herself, Margaret had written to the solicitor accepting the inheritance. The autumn rain continued to fall softly across Bath, washing the pavements clean beneath the pale October sky, while somewhere far to the north, beyond fields she had never crossed and villages she had never seen, the small tailoring shop of Ashcombe waited patiently, as though it had always known she would eventually find her way to its door. Margaret left Bath on a cool October morning, beneath a sky the colour of faded pearl, when the first thin frost still lingered upon the hedgerows, and the fields beyond the railway carriage windows lay wrapped in long ribbons of mist. The farther north the train carried her, the gentler the countryside seemed to become. The broad avenues and elegant crescents of the city slowly gave way to smaller market towns, ancient stone churches whose square towers rose quietly above clusters of chimneys, and wide meadows divided by low dry stone walls that had stood so long upon the land they appeared less like things built by men than natural parts of the hills themselves. She spent much of the journey beside the carriage window, with a travelling rug across her knees and a small leather valise resting beneath the seat. Occasionally, she turned another page of the novel she had brought with her, but before long she found herself reading the landscape instead. Sheep grazed patiently beneath ash trees already turning gold. Narrow rivers reflected strips of silver light beneath old stone bridges. Smoke drifted lazily from farmhouse chimneys into the cool afternoon air, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of peat and oak that belonged only to villages preparing for another English winter. As daylight slowly softened toward evening, the railway at last reached the small branch line that served the northern villages. The train became quieter with every stop. Passengers descended carrying baskets, parcels tied with string, or bouquets wrapped in brown paper, until Margaret found herself almost alone in the compartment. It seemed to her that the farther she travelled, the more hurried voices disappeared, replaced by a silence that felt neither lonely nor empty, but simply patient. Ashcombe Station consisted of little more than a single platform, a weathered waiting room with green-painted wooden benches, and a station master wearing a dark wool coat polished smooth by many winters of service. A brass bell hung beneath the eaves, chiming softly as the train came to its final halt. Beyond the platform stretched fields already touched by evening mist, while somewhere unseen a flock of rooks crossed the fading sky, their wings beating together in slow, measured rhythm. A horse-drawn trap awaited her outside the station. The driver, a cheerful middle-aged man, wrapped in a thick tweed coat, greeted her with the easy courtesy of someone who had known every face in the village for most of his life. "Mrs. Ellison, I presume? Mr. Reeves asked that I bring you straight to the shop." Margaret nodded, and soon they were moving along a narrow lane bordered by ancient hawthorn hedges whose leaves had begun to turn rust-red beneath the advancing autumn. The wheels rolled quietly over damp earth before reaching the village itself, where the road became worn cobblestones, glistening from an afternoon shower. Ashcombe revealed itself without ceremony. It was neither large nor grand, and yet Margaret felt almost immediately that it possessed the quiet confidence of places that have never needed to impress strangers. The cottages were built from weathered grey stone, darkened by generations of rain, each roof crowned with uneven chimneys from which pale smoke drifted lazily into the cooling air. Small diamond-paned windows glowed with warm lamplight behind lace curtains, while climbing ivy embraced many of the older walls, as though determined never to surrender them to time. The high street curved gently through the centre of the village, like a slow stream. There was a bakery, from whose open door escaped the comforting aroma of fresh loaves and cinnamon buns cooling upon wooden racks. Beside it stood a modest bookseller, whose display window contained neatly stacked hymnals, almanacs, and several well-loved novels. A blacksmith's forge rang faintly somewhere farther along the street, though even the rhythm of the hammer seemed softened by the gathering dusk. Women carrying baskets exchanged quiet greetings with one another. Children chased fallen leaves along the edge of the pavement, and an elderly gentleman paused outside the post office simply to remove his hat and wish the driver good evening. Nothing hurried, nothing competed to be noticed. Every small thing appeared content to occupy exactly its proper place. At the far end of the street stood the building Margaret had travelled so many miles to find. Its painted wooden sign swung gently above the pavement beneath black iron brackets worn smooth by half a century of wind. Fairchild Tailors. Since 1842, the gold lettering had faded slightly, yet someone had cared enough to repaint it from time to time without making it appear new. Ivy climbed one corner of the stone facade, stopping just short of the second-floor windows, as though respecting the boundaries Agnes herself had once set. Two large display windows overlooked the street, each arranged with quiet dignity rather than commercial ambition. One contained a gentleman's dark wool overcoat, displayed beside a polished walking cane and felt hat. The other showed a child's winter coat of deep navy broadcloth, its small brass buttons gleaming warmly beneath the gaslight. Margaret found herself pausing before opening the door. There was something curiously intimate about entering a place that had belonged entirely to another person's daily life for more than 50 years. She almost felt she ought to knock first. When at last she pressed down the polished brass handle, a small bell suspended above the doorway rang with a clear, familiar note that seemed to awaken the room rather than disturb it. Warmth greeted her immediately. Not the overwhelming heat of a large fire, but the steady comfort of coal burning patiently somewhere farther inside the building. The air carried the rich fragrance of freshly pressed wool, beeswax furniture polish, cedar drawers, clean linen, and old oak that had absorbed generations of winters into its grain. Beneath those scents lingered something subtler still, the faint metallic perfume of polished tailoring shears and the dry sweetness of tailor's chalk rubbed into cloth. The workshop beyond the front room appeared so perfectly ordered that Margaret instinctively lowered her voice, although no one had yet spoken. A long cutting table occupied the center of the room, its surface worn smooth by countless lengths of cloth, measured and trimmed with practiced precision. Large iron shears rested upon it, exactly parallel to a folded measuring tape, while neatly stacked bolts of tweed, broadcloth, velvet, and fine wool stood arranged according to color inside open oak cabinets reaching almost to the ceiling. Wooden shelves held boxes of carefully sorted buttons, reels of silk thread, folded paper patterns tied with cotton ribbon, and ledgers whose leather bindings had darkened beautifully with age. Against one wall stood 3 dress forms draped in half-finished garments awaiting their final fittings. Near the window, an old black cast-iron stove radiated gentle warmth, and beside it a kettle hummed quietly, releasing thin curls of steam that caught the amber afternoon light filtering through the glass. The only sound was the measured ticking of a walnut grandfather clock standing beside the staircase. Then another sound joined it, the soft, almost musical rhythm of needle passing through heavy cloth. Near the rear window sat an elderly man whose entire attention remained fixed upon the small navy coat resting across his knees. His silver hair was neatly combed beneath the glow of an oil lamp, and spectacles perched low upon the bridge of his nose, while his weathered hands guided the needle with remarkable steadiness. Every movement possessed the quiet assurance that comes only after a lifetime of repeating the same craft until it becomes as natural as breathing itself. Only after completing the final stitch did he lift his eyes. He removed his spectacles slowly, folded them with great care, and rose from his chair. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, inclining his head with gentle dignity. "Welcome to Ashcombe." His voice carried neither surprise nor excessive warmth. It was simply the voice of a man who had been expecting someone exactly at this hour, and was quietly pleased that she had arrived safely. "I am Edmund Reeves." Margaret extended her hand. "You have been with Miss Fairchild a very long time, I believe." A faint smile, almost too modest to be called one, touched the corners of his mouth. 48 years, this Michaelmas. He glanced briefly around the workshop, his eyes lingering upon the cutting table, before returning to Margaret. "I was 12 when she first placed a needle in my hand." There was no boastfulness in the statement, only gratitude. Margaret followed his gaze across the familiar room and, for the first time, understood that although Agnes Fairchild herself was gone, almost nothing within these walls had changed. The scissors still rested where she had last laid them. The measuring tape remained draped over the wooden mannequin, exactly as though she might return after taking tea. Even the unfinished child's coat upon Edmund's work table seemed less abandoned than merely waiting, patiently confident that someone would complete the final stitches. Edmund lowered himself once more into his chair. Without another word, he threaded his needle again and resumed sewing the small winter coat with hands that had repeated the same careful motion for nearly half a century. Margaret watched the needle rise and disappear into the dark blue wool, listening to the quiet ticking of the old clock and the gentle whisper of thread being drawn tight, and felt, though she could not yet have explained why, that she had stepped into a place where time itself moved differently from the rest of the world. The shop did not seem to resist the passing years. It simply gathered them, one careful stitch after another, until they became part of the fabric from which its life had always been made. The first week passed with a gentleness that surprised Margaret. She had expected confusion, perhaps even awkwardness, entering a business whose language she did not yet speak. Instead, Ashcombe seemed determined to teach her patiently, allowing each day to reveal only as much as she was ready to understand. No one hurried her with questions about the future of the shop. No customer asked whether she intended to remain. They simply greeted her with the same quiet courtesy they had once shown Agnes, as though they believed certain things would settle themselves naturally if left alone long enough. Each morning began before the village clock struck 8. Margaret would descend the narrow staircase from the small apartment above the workshop, while dawn still lingered pale behind the frosted windows. Downstairs she always found Edmund already at work, a pot of tea steaming gently beside the coal stove, the cutting table swept spotless, the day's orders laid out in careful piles according to delivery dates. The shop itself seemed to awaken gradually, with the village beyond its windows. First came the baker, carrying warm loaves across the street. Then the blacksmith's rhythmic hammering drifted faintly through the morning mist. Soon afterward, the church bell announced the hour, and with it the first customers quietly opened the door beneath the familiar chime. Margaret discovered that a village tailor knew far more than measurements. People entered carrying the ordinary concerns of their lives, along with coats needing mending or jackets requiring alteration. Farmers discussed the weather while being fitted for winter waistcoats. Young couples ordered garments for weddings that would not take place until spring. Elderly widows brought shawls whose worn edges had been repaired so many times they seemed to contain more careful stitches than original cloth. Every conversation unfolded without haste, accompanied by cups of tea, laughter that never rose too loudly, and the comfortable silence shared by people who had known one another for decades. Edmund worked throughout it all with remarkable calm. His tape measure moved around shoulders and sleeves, almost as naturally as a musician's fingers across piano keys. He listened more than he spoke, offering advice only when asked, yet somehow remembering every customer's preference without consulting a single notebook.
Mr. Fletcher preferred heavier tweed because his rheumatism troubled him in damp weather. Reverend Collins always requested deeper inside pockets for sermon notes.
Mrs. Pennington disliked brass buttons because they caught too much light during church services. Watching him, Margaret often forgot that she stood inside a business at all. The shop felt less like a place where clothes were sold than a quiet room where the village itself came to be gently cared for. It was toward the end of that first week that she began noticing something she could not immediately explain. One cold Thursday morning, shortly after the first fire of autumn had been lit in nearly every chimney along High Street, a young woman entered carrying the hand of a little boy no older than 6. His boots were polished carefully, though their leather had been patched more than once, and his knitted scarf had clearly been mended by someone who possessed far more affection than skill. The child looked about the shop with solemn curiosity, while Edmund disappeared into the rear workroom and returned carrying a neatly folded navy blue coat. It was beautifully made. The wool was thick enough for Yorkshire winters, the lining quilted with astonishing care, the collar finished in soft brown velvet, and every button sewn with tiny, perfectly even stitches. Edmund knelt before the boy without ceremony. "Let's see whether you've grown quite as much as your grandmother predicted." The little fellow slipped his arms obediently into the sleeves, while Edmund adjusted the shoulders and smoothed the cloth across his back with the practiced affection of someone dressing his own grandson. The coat fitted perfectly. The child's face brightened at once. He turned toward his mother with the unguarded delight that only children possess when they discover something made exactly for them. "It's warm," he whispered. His mother smiled, though Margaret noticed the unmistakable relief that briefly crossed her expression before she thanked Edmund quietly, buttoned the coat herself, and kissed the top of her son's head. Then she reached instinctively toward her handbag. Edmund raised one gentle hand. "No need, Mrs. Carter." "Oh, I know," she replied with an easy smile. "I only wish to thank you properly." She squeezed Edmund's hand for a brief moment, nodded politely to Margaret, and left the shop with her little boy, skipping happily across the cobblestones outside, already swinging his new sleeves through the cool October air. Margaret watched them disappear into the mist. She assumed, naturally enough, that payment had been arranged beforehand. Yet before noon, another family arrived. This time, it was 2 sisters, dressed in matching grey bonnets, who received matching green wool coats. Again Edmund checked the sleeves, fastened each button, brushed imaginary dust from the shoulders, and sent them away smiling. Again no money changed hands. By Saturday afternoon, the pattern had repeated itself 5 times. Sometimes it was only 1 child, sometimes 3. Once an elderly grandfather arrived, carrying his sleeping granddaughter wrapped in an old blanket. Edmund carefully measured her without waking her and promised the finished coat would be ready before the following Tuesday. No prices were discussed. No invoices were written. No coins touched the counter. At first, Margaret wondered whether these families perhaps settled their accounts annually or maintained long-standing credit with the shop. Such arrangements were hardly unknown in country villages, yet the more she observed, the less convincing that explanation became. There was a curious absence of embarrassment. None of the parents behaved like customers receiving charity, nor did they appear to believe they owed a future payment. Instead, they accepted the coats with the quiet dignity of people receiving something already understood to belong to them. Their gratitude was genuine, yet entirely free of apology. It was this, more than anything else, that unsettled Margaret. On the following Monday, after the last customer had departed and dusk gathered softly outside the shop windows, she carried one of the account ledgers from the office to the cutting table. The heavy leather cover released the familiar scent of old paper and ink as she opened it beneath the glow of the oil lamp. Page after page displayed Edmund's careful handwriting, stretching back through many years. Every commission appeared exactly as one would expect: gentlemen's frock coats, ladies' walking dresses, military uniforms, riding jackets, mourning clothes, christening gowns, wedding alterations. Each order listed measurements, materials used, hours worked, and payment received with almost mathematical precision. She turned farther back, another volume, then another. The bookkeeping was immaculate. Nothing appeared careless, nothing appeared hidden. Yet when she searched specifically for the children's winter coats she had watched leave the shop all week, the pages yielded almost nothing at all. There were names of fabrics purchased, buttons ordered, thread delivered, but nowhere could she find the corresponding payments. She counted again, calculated twice, compared one ledger with another. The figures simply refused to balance. That evening, after Edmund had finished locking the front door, Margaret remained seated beside the cutting table while the old clock ticked steadily into the quiet shop. The lamplight cast long golden reflections across the polished shears, and beyond the windows High Street had almost disappeared beneath the cool blue mist of early evening. She looked up from the open ledger. "Mr. Reeves." He raised his head from the coat he was pressing. "Yes, Mrs. Ellison?" She hesitated, almost reluctant to disturb the peaceful rhythm of the room. "I cannot seem to find where the children's coats are paid for." Edmund did not answer immediately. Instead, he folded the finished garment with slow, practiced hands before placing it carefully upon the shelf beside the others, awaiting collection. Only then did he meet her eyes. A smile, warm with memory rather than amusement, softened the weathered lines of his face. "They are paid for, Mrs. Ellison." Margaret waited. The silence lingered pleasantly between them, accompanied only by the quiet settling of the coal fire. Finally she asked, "By whom?" Edmund glanced briefly toward the front window, where the lamps of High Street glowed softly through the mist, illuminating the peaceful village that had already begun preparing itself for another winter. Then, in the same calm voice with which he measured cloth and greeted old friends, he answered only, "They were paid for, a very long time ago." And with that, he returned to his stitching, leaving Margaret alone with the impossible ledger and a mystery that, she sensed, had been patiently waiting for someone to ask exactly that question. The question Edmund had answered so quietly remained with Margaret long after the lamps along High Street had been extinguished and the village itself had surrendered to sleep. They were paid for, a very long time ago. The words possessed neither mystery nor drama when spoken, yet they settled somewhere deep within her thoughts, with the peculiar weight of something that was almost certainly true, though entirely impossible to understand. That night she slept in the modest apartment above the workshop for the first time. The bedroom overlooked the rooftops of Ashcombe, where chimney pots rose from weathered slate like dark silhouettes against the pale October sky. Shortly before dawn she awoke not to the rumble of city traffic, as she had done for more than 30 years in Bath, but to a sound so gentle that for several moments she could not identify it. Somewhere below, a baker was unloading fresh loaves from a cart. Wooden crates touched the cobblestones with soft, hollow knocks. A horse stamped patiently in the cool morning air. Then came the distant pealing of the church bell, slow and measured across the sleeping village, followed by the cheerful chatter of sparrows gathering beneath the eaves of the opposite cottages. She lay still beneath the heavy quilt, listening. There are places, she thought, where morning does not arrive all at once, but unfolds little by little, like light spreading across a piece of carefully woven cloth. By the time she descended to the workshop, Edmund had already lit the stove. The fragrance of coal mingled with the clean scent of pressed wool, while weak autumn sunlight slipped through the tall front windows, illuminating thousands of tiny dust motes drifting lazily through the still air. He greeted her exactly as he had the morning before, neither more warmly nor more formally, simply with the reassuring steadiness of a man who had repeated the same beginning to each day for nearly half a century. Margaret accepted a cup of tea, thanked him, and spoke nothing further about the ledgers. Instead, she waited. She had spent too many years beside an academic husband not to recognize that some questions answered themselves only after sufficient observation. Arthur had often remarked that the greatest mistake made by impatient scholars was believing they understood a subject after discovering merely one unusual fact. First, he would say with gentle amusement, learn how ordinary things behave. Only then will you notice what truly refuses to behave at all. So Margaret watched. For several days, she devoted herself to understanding the rhythm of the business itself. She learned where each bolt of cloth was stored, how deliveries arrived every Tuesday from Leeds, why wool intended for riding coats was kept in the driest corner of the storeroom, and how Edmund marked every customer's measurements, not only with figures, but with tiny handwritten observations that no stranger would ever have understood. Beside one gentleman's measurements, he had written simply, right shoulder lower after harvest accident. Another read, Mrs. Fletcher prefers sleeves, half an inch longer, since her arthritis worsened. It struck Margaret that these records contained not merely sizes, but lives quietly observed over many decades. When customers were absent, she began opening the older ledgers. There were dozens of them. Some dated back almost half a century, their leather bindings softened by constant handling, their pages yellowed gently at the edges but preserved with remarkable care. Agnes's handwriting changed almost imperceptibly through the years, beginning in the graceful confidence of youth, before becoming firmer, slower, and finally, slightly tremulous during the last few volumes. Yet throughout all those years, one quality never altered. Every entry possessed extraordinary precision. Nothing had been forgotten. Nothing appeared careless. Every yard of cloth purchased, every spool of silk thread, every brass button, every length of lining, every day's wages, every tax payment, and delivery charge had been recorded with astonishing discipline. Margaret had never considered bookkeeping an elegant craft, but as she turned those pages, she found herself admiring Agnes in much the same way one admires a gifted musician who never plays a false note. The more carefully she studied the accounts, however, the more impossible they became. The shop should not have survived. It certainly should not have prospered. The income from gentlemen's frock coats, ladies' walking dresses, mourning attire, uniforms, christening gowns and wedding commissions was respectable, certainly enough to support a modest tailoring establishment. The expenses, though considerable, remained sensible and consistent. Every figure balanced precisely from one season to the next. Until winter arrived. Each October, almost without exception, purchases of children's wool increased dramatically. Dark blue broadcloth, heavy tweed, soft flannel lining, small horn buttons, extra batting for insulation, enough materials to produce dozens upon dozens of winter coats. Yet no corresponding invoices appeared, no children's accounts, no payments, no debts carried into spring. Margaret sharpened her pencil and began calculating independently upon loose sheets of paper. She estimated the quantity of cloth consumed, the number of working hours required, the cost of thread, buttons, and lining. She repeated the calculations twice more, convinced she must have overlooked something embarrassingly obvious. The arithmetic refused to cooperate. Even using the most conservative estimates, the children's coats represented a substantial expense every single winter. By all ordinary commercial reasoning, Fairchild Tailors should have been operating at a loss for decades, yet the ledgers insisted otherwise. Toward the end of one particularly quiet afternoon, rain began falling beyond the front windows in long silver threads, softening the outlines of the opposite cottages until High Street appeared wrapped inside a veil of mist. Edmund worked silently beside the window, shortening the sleeves of a gentleman's overcoat, while Margaret continued comparing figures from different years spread across the cutting table. At last she noticed something curious. Not a missing entry, not a hidden account, something stranger. The shop's annual profit scarcely varied at all. Whether the winter had been harsh or mild, whether business had flourished or slowed, whether orders had increased or declined, the final balance remained almost uncannily steady. It was as though some unseen hand had quietly corrected every year's accounts before closing the books. Margaret frowned. Businesses did not behave so politely. Life certainly did not. She reached for another ledger. This one dated nearly 30 years earlier. Again the same pattern emerged. Respectable income, ordinary expenses, children's coats appearing in abundance, no payment recorded. She closed the volume slowly. Outside, the rain had deepened. Water flowed gently along the edges of the cobbled street, while the gas lamps flickered to life one by one beneath the gathering twilight. Their warm amber light reflected upon the wet stones, turning the village into a landscape of quiet gold and soft shadow. Edmund finally laid aside his needle. "You've been staring at those books all afternoon." Margaret smiled faintly, without looking up. "They're staring back." He chuckled, a low, pleasant sound she had not yet heard from him. "Miss Fairchild used to say the same thing." Margaret lifted her eyes. "I have examined every ledger I can find, and they are perfectly honest." Edmund nodded. They are also impossible." Again he nodded, exactly as though she had reached a conclusion he had expected all along. "There are no hidden investors. No wealthy benefactor. No church fund. No." Mrs. Ellison. She leaned back in her chair, folded her hands upon the table, and looked across the workshop, where the evening light rested gently upon shelves of folded cloth that had waited patiently through generations of winters. "Then the numbers cannot be true." Edmund considered this for a long moment. "They're true, then something else is missing." He smiled again, though this time there was unmistakable affection behind it. "Yes." Margaret waited. "So where is it?" Edmund rose slowly, crossed the room, and carefully extinguished one of the oil lamps that was no longer needed. The workshop immediately grew quieter still, the remaining pool of golden light gathering around the cutting table, while darkness settled softly among the upper shelves. When he finally answered, his voice was little louder than the ticking of the old walnut clock. "The figures are complete, Mrs. Ellison." He rested one weathered hand upon the polished oak of the cutting table, the very table at which Agnes had worked for most of her life. "It is the story behind the figures that has not yet been entered." With those words he returned to locking the shop for the evening, leaving Margaret seated alone among the ledgers, increasingly certain that the greatest secret hidden inside Fairchild Tailors had never been concealed in its accounts at all. It had simply been waiting for someone patient enough to realize that numbers, however carefully written, can record only what money buys and never what kindness quietly leaves behind. By the second week of October, Margaret had settled almost unconsciously into the rhythm of the tailoring shop, and the days themselves seemed to have adopted the measured pace that governed every corner of Ashcombe. Morning light entered the front windows in long amber bands that slowly crept across the oak floorboards until noon, only to retreat again as afternoon shadows gathered beneath the shelves of folded cloth. The grandfather clock announced each passing hour with such quiet dignity that Margaret eventually stopped noticing its chime, much as one ceases to notice the steady breathing of an old friend seated nearby. Outside, the village continued its gentle procession toward winter. The ivy, climbing the neighboring cottages, deepened from green to bronze. Chimney smoke lingered longer above the rooftops before dissolving into the pale sky, and each evening the air carried a sharper fragrance of damp leaves, peat fires, and distant rain drifting over the Yorkshire hills. It was during these peaceful days that Margaret began observing Edmund more closely. She had long since accepted that no ledger alone would explain the impossible arithmetic of Fairchild Tailors. If an answer existed, she increasingly suspected it might be found not among the numbers, but among the quiet habits of the man who had worked beside Agnes for nearly 50 years. There are craftsmen, Arthur had once remarked, whose greatest knowledge is never written down because it has long since passed from the mind into the hands. Watching Edmund now, Margaret understood exactly what her husband had meant. The old tailor wasted nothing. At first the habit appeared merely economical, the natural caution of a man who had lived through lean harvests and difficult winters. Whenever a gentleman's overcoat had been cut from a heavy length of charcoal wool, Edmund would carefully gather every remaining piece, even those no larger than the palm of his hand. He never swept them casually into the scrap basket, as Margaret imagined most workshops might. Instead, he spread each piece across the cutting table beneath the afternoon light, turning it slowly between his fingers before trimming away only the uneven edges. Then, with remarkable patience, he folded every fragment into neat rectangles, tied them together with soft cotton tape, and wrote a few small words upon a paper label in careful pencil: navy broadcloth, brown tweed, children's flannel, fine lamb's wool. The bundles disappeared into shallow drawers built beneath the great cutting table, each drawer arranged with almost scholarly precision, wool beside wool, lining beside lining, velvet collars separated according to color, buttons preserved in tiny linen bags no larger than handkerchiefs. Margaret watched this ritual for several days before finally asking, with the casual curiosity she hoped concealed the depth of her interest, "Surely those pieces are too small to be useful." Edmund glanced up briefly, then smiled in the quiet way he often did before returning his attention to his work. "They'll tell us themselves what they wish to become." The answer puzzled her. She assumed he meant only that enough small pieces, gathered together over time, might someday prove useful for repairs. Yet as the days passed, she realized he treated every fragment with precisely the same care he afforded an untouched length of expensive Yorkshire wool. Nothing was discarded, nothing dismissed as worthless merely because it had become small. One rainy afternoon, a prosperous sheep farmer arrived to collect 3 heavy winter jackets commissioned for his sons before the first snowfall. The order required nearly an entire bolt of dark forest green tweed, and when Edmund finished trimming the final sleeve, the cutting table lay scattered with irregular pieces of cloth left over from the work. Margaret expected him to clear the table. Instead, he spent nearly half an hour arranging the scraps upon the oak surface. Large pieces beside smaller ones, curved edges matched against straight, narrow strips rotated this way and that. Occasionally he lifted one fragment and replaced it somewhere entirely different, studying the arrangement with such concentration that Margaret almost felt she was watching someone assemble a complicated map whose destination only he could see. Finally he nodded almost imperceptibly. Without measuring once, he gathered the selected pieces into a neat pile and carried them toward the rear workshop. Curiosity overcame discretion. A few minutes later, Margaret followed, The rear room was smaller than the public workshop and overlooked a narrow courtyard where rainwater dripped steadily from old gutters into a moss-covered stone trough. Here the afternoon light fell softer through frosted glass windows, illuminating shelves crowded with patterns accumulated over generations. Edmund stood at a secondary work table, pressing the mismatched pieces together, edge by edge. To Margaret's astonishment, the seams all but disappeared. His needle moved with astonishing precision, joining one remnant to another, so skillfully that the finished cloth appeared almost woven rather than stitched. He matched the direction of every thread, aligned each pattern with microscopic care, and pressed every seam flat beneath a warm iron until it became nearly invisible. She stepped closer. "I can hardly tell where one piece ends." Edmund smiled without looking up. "That is the idea." He continued sewing. "Miss Fairchild used to say a child ought never feel he's wearing someone else's leftovers." Margaret said nothing. She watched the growing panel of cloth expand steadily beneath Edmund's hands until, little by little, it resembled not a collection of remnants, but a perfectly respectable piece of fabric. The realization came gradually, not as a sudden revelation, rather as one of those truths that quietly assembles itself before the mind fully notices. Over the following week, she paid even closer attention. Every substantial commission left behind remnants. Every remnant was carefully sorted. Every bundle found its place beneath the cutting table. Then, late each afternoon after customers had gone home, Edmund disappeared into the rear workshop, carrying those same carefully preserved pieces. One evening, Margaret happened to remain upstairs writing letters to Charlotte until dusk. As she descended the narrow staircase, intending only to wish Edmund good night, she paused halfway down. The workshop lamps still burned. Beyond the doorway, she could see Edmund bent over the great cutting table once more. Spread before him was not a gentleman's frock coat, nor a lady's walking jacket. It was a remarkably small winter coat, dark blue, beautifully cut, its sleeves scarcely longer than Margaret's forearm. She watched unseen while Edmund stitched the velvet collar into place with the same meticulous attention he had given that morning to a wealthy merchant's expensive overcoat. Every seam received equal care. Every stitch lay perfectly even. There was not the slightest indication that portions of the garment had once belonged to entirely different pieces of cloth. When at last he finished, he lifted the coat gently between both hands and held it toward the lamplight. It looked flawless. No child wearing it would ever imagine it had begun life as a dozen forgotten remnants lying scattered across another tailor's table. Margaret stepped quietly into the room. "I should never have guessed." Edmund looked over his shoulder. "Nor should they." "They?" "The children." He brushed an invisible thread from the sleeve before laying the coat neatly beside several others already completed. "They deserve new coats." Margaret ran her fingertips lightly across the rich wool. "It feels new." "It is new, but it was made from—" He shook his head gently. "No, Mrs. Ellison." His weathered hand rested for a moment upon the finished garment. It was made from cloth that had simply not yet discovered its proper purpose. The words lingered between them, as softly as the steam rising from the iron. Margaret found herself looking again at the row of finished children's coats arranged neatly along the rear wall. There were perhaps 15 already completed, each one different in color and style, yet every one possessing the same careful workmanship that distinguished every garment leaving Fairchild Tailors. Not one looked improvised. Not one suggested economy. They were beautiful because someone had believed children should never have to wear poverty upon their shoulders. As they extinguished the lamps and prepared to close the shop for the evening, Margaret glanced once more toward the drawers beneath the cutting table where Edmund had stored another day's remnants. She now understood one small part of the mystery. The shop did not purchase nearly as much cloth for the children's coats as she had first calculated. Agnes had found a way to transform what others might have discarded into garments no child would ever feel ashamed to wear. It was ingenious. It was compassionate. And yet, as Margaret mentally returned to the ledgers she had studied so carefully, she knew at once that this discovery, remarkable though it was, could not possibly explain everything. The remnants saved cloth. They did not eliminate its cost. They explained the craftsmanship. They did not explain the missing money. Somewhere within Fairchild Tailors, another answer still waited patiently beneath 50 years of careful silence, and Margaret sensed she had only just begun to pull at the first loose thread. The evening Margaret found the hidden drawer was one of those late October evenings when the village seemed to draw its curtains earlier than usual, not because the hour was especially late, but because the cold had begun to press gently against every window and door, as though winter had sent its first quiet messenger ahead. By 5 o'clock, High Street had already softened into a blue-grey dusk. The lamps outside the bakery and the post office glowed in small amber halos, and the wet cobblestones reflected them faintly, making the narrow street appear almost like a dark river running between rows of stone cottages. Inside Fairchild Tailors, the workshop remained warm. The stove in the corner burned with a steady red heart, and the scent of coal smoke mingled with wool, cedar drawers, tailor's chalk, and the faint sweetness of beeswax polish. Edmund had gone upstairs to fetch an old pattern book he believed might help him finish a boy's coat whose shoulders required adjustment. Margaret remained at the cutting table, sorting through scraps of accounts that seemed to offer answers only to withdraw them again. The ledgers had brought her to the edge of understanding, but no farther. She now knew that the children's coats were made partly from leftover cloth, saved with a tenderness that seemed almost moral rather than merely practical. She knew Edmund's work made those remnants into garments no child would be ashamed to wear. She knew the shop purchased less fabric for winter coats than she had first assumed. Yet the money still did not explain itself. Thread cost money. Lining cost money. Buttons cost money. Coal for long evenings cost money. Time, though Edmund never seemed to count it, had value too. Margaret ran one finger along the edge of the old table, her thoughts moving patiently through the same impossible arithmetic, when something shifted beneath her hand. It was not much, only the faintest movement in the wood. She leaned closer. The cutting table was older than anything else in the shop, except perhaps the grandfather clock. Its surface was scarred by nearly half a century of careful work, every mark softened by use, until the whole piece of furniture seemed less made than seasoned. Along one side, just beneath the overhanging lip, she noticed a narrow seam, almost hidden beneath darkened varnish. Margaret pressed gently. Nothing happened. She tried again, this time farther along the edge. A small wooden catch gave way with a tired click. A shallow drawer slid open. For several moments she simply stood looking down at it. The drawer contained no jewels, no banknotes, no private confession sealed in dramatic wax. Only a small leather-bound notebook, a bundle of old receipts tied with faded blue thread, and a brass thimble, darkened from long use. The notebook was thin, no larger than her palm. Its cover bore no title, only one word written in Agnes Fairchild's neat hand: allowances. Margaret lifted it carefully and carried it to the lamp. The first page was dated 1852. The entries were unlike anything in the formal ledgers. There were no grand totals, no columns of profit and loss, no official accounts intended for banks, solicitors, or tax collectors. Instead, there were names, dates, and small additions written so lightly that they seemed almost embarrassed to exist. Mr. Joseph Baker, 1 extra yard of brown wool. Mrs. Eliza Whitmore, 2 horn buttons, added without remark. Hughes family, Lining included in Sunday coat. Dr. Avery, 3 shillings overpaid, not corrected. Mr. Cole, blacksmith, paid for repair twice, second sum retained. Margaret read the entries once, then again. A slow understanding began to gather at the edges of her mind, but it was so unexpected that she almost resisted it. She turned the page. More names followed. Some appeared only once. Others returned year after year. Small sums, tiny additions, a penny here, threepence there, an extra length of ribbon, a deliberately generous measurement of cloth. Nothing large enough to distress a customer, nothing visible enough to provoke a question. Yet there they were, season after season, written in Agnes's precise hand and preserved outside the official accounts, not because they were dishonest, Margaret realized with a growing stillness, but because they belonged to a different kind of bookkeeping. The drawer's small click had brought Edmund back downstairs. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the pattern book under one arm, his face showing no surprise at all. "You found it then?" Margaret looked up. "Did Miss Fairchild mean for me to? I expect she meant for you to find it when you had looked long enough." He came into the room slowly and set the pattern book upon the table. Margaret rested her hand upon the open notebook. These people paid more than they owed, yes, but they did not know. No, and that money was used for the children's coats. Edmund folded his hands before him. Not only money. He nodded toward the bundles of cloth sorted beneath the table. Cloth, buttons, lining, time. A shop has many ways of saving what people do not miss. Margaret was silent for some time. Outside, a carriage passed slowly along High Street, its wheels muffled by damp cobbles. Somewhere across the street, a door opened and released a brief burst of lamplight and voices before closing again. At last she said, carefully, "Mr. Reeves, this is not quite honest." The old tailor did not appear offended. "No," he replied gently, "not quite." The answer surprised her. He sat down opposite her, beneath the warm glow of the oil lamp, and for the first time since her arrival, Margaret saw how tired he looked. Not weak, not diminished, only old, in the way that people become old after carrying one duty faithfully for so long that the duty itself seems to have shaped their bones. "Miss Fairchild used to say," he continued, "that most people wish to be kind, but many are afraid of being seen at it." Margaret looked down again at the page. The names seemed different now. Not customers, not accounts, participants. Unknowing participants, perhaps, but participants all the same. She charged them without asking. She charged those who could spare it, and decided that herself? She did. There was no defensiveness in his voice, only truth. Margaret turned another page and saw familiar village names, the same people who had greeted her in the shop, nodded to her in church, passed her in the street, with baskets and umbrellas, and children at their sides. She thought of Mrs. Pennington, who disliked brass buttons, Reverend Collins with his deep sermon pockets, Mr. Fletcher with the lower right shoulder. Each had paid, little by little, year by year, into a fund none of them had known existed, and from those small unnoticed additions had come the warm coats, leaving the shop every autumn in children's arms. The discovery might have seemed improper, it might have seemed manipulative, yet sitting there in the amber lamplight, with the old notebook open beneath her hand and the scent of wool and coal smoke around her, Margaret found that her first feeling was not indignation, but awe. A whole village had been sowing warmth into its own children, without knowing it. The thought was so strange and tender that she could not immediately speak. Edmund reached across the table and turned back to one of the earliest entries. "Look here." Margaret bent closer. October 1852. First winter allowance, sufficient for 7 coats. No child refused. Beneath it, in Agnes's handwriting, was another line. The kindness must be small enough not to frighten the giver and large enough to reach the child. Margaret read the sentence several times. Something inside her softened, though she did not entirely wish it to. She had spent much of her adult life believing that goodness ought to be clear, named, properly offered, and properly received. Her husband had been a man of principles, and Margaret had lived beside those principles so long that she had come to trust order almost as much as virtue. Yet here was a different sort of virtue, untidy and hidden, passing quietly beneath invoices and hems and folded wool. It troubled her, it moved her, both at once. Edmund watched her kindly. "Miss Fairchild knew you might not approve. I am not sure I do." "No," he smiled faintly. "But you're beginning to understand why she asked you not to change the first winter." Margaret closed the notebook with great care. The brass thimble still lay inside the secret drawer, catching a small circle of lamplight upon its worn rim. She picked it up and turned it between her fingers. It was ordinary, scratched, slightly bent from years of use. Agnes's thimble. The hand that had written those entries had also stitched the coats, folded the cloth, measured the children, and carried this quiet account through half a century without explanation. Margaret placed the thimble back in the drawer. Did anyone ever find out? Some guessed, and said nothing? Edmund looked toward the window, beyond which Ashcombe lay under a mist of lamplight and cold. People in villages know when not to know something. The answer was so perfectly Ashcombe that Margaret almost smiled. She sat for a while longer after Edmund went to bank the stove for the night. The shop gradually settled into evening, its shadows lengthening among shelves of wool and pattern books, its clock ticking steadily, as though measuring not hours, but continuance. When at last she rose, she did not return the notebook to the secret drawer. Instead, she carried it upstairs with the formal ledgers. There were still questions, many questions. Who had first agreed to this arrangement? Why had the village accepted the coats so easily? How had Agnes sustained such a custom for so long without resentment, exposure, or failure? But one truth had become plain. The children's coats had not been made from nothing. They had been made from small, unnoticed abundance, from a little more cloth than required, a little more payment than necessary, a little more care than anyone had asked for. And perhaps, Margaret thought, as she paused beside the dark upstairs window and looked out over the sleeping roofs of Ashcombe, that was why the accounts had never balanced in any ordinary way. Because the true balance had not been kept in pounds, shillings and pence. It had been kept in warm shoulders, dry sleeves, and children walking into winter without shame. The discovery of the small allowance book did not satisfy Margaret's curiosity so much as deepen it. For the first time since arriving in Ashcombe, she sensed that she had stepped beyond the outer walls of the mystery and into its quiet interior. The figures in the ledgers no longer seemed impossible, nor did Edmund's patient answers appear deliberately evasive. Instead, everything pointed gently toward one person whose absence could still be felt in every corner of the shop. Agnes Fairchild had left behind more than a tailoring business. She had left behind a way of thinking that had quietly shaped an entire village. Yet Margaret understood that she still knew almost nothing about the woman herself. Several mornings later, rain settled over Ashcombe before sunrise. It was the sort of gentle rain that seemed to belong entirely to England, falling not with violence, but with remarkable persistence, wrapping rooftops, gardens and hedgerows in a soft silver veil that blurred every outline without quite hiding it. The stone walls of High Street darkened beneath the moisture, ivy leaves glistened like polished emeralds, and little streams of water trickled along the edges of the cobblestones before disappearing beneath ancient drains worn smooth by generations of winters. Business was unusually quiet. Only a handful of customers ventured out before noon. and by early afternoon, the workshop had fallen into a peaceful silence, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock, the gentle hiss of rain against the window panes, and the steady whisper of Edmund's needle passing through heavy wool. Margaret found herself looking toward the narrow staircase leading to the rooms above the shop. She had explored the apartment where Agnes had lived, but one room at the back remained almost untouched since her arrival. Edmund had mentioned it only once, referring to it simply as Miss Fairchild's room, with the quiet reverence one might reserve for a church that no longer held services, but still seemed sacred nonetheless. When Edmund left briefly to deliver a repaired overcoat to the vicarage, Margaret climbed the stairs. The hallway upstairs was narrow, its floorboards gently creaking beneath her steps, while the wallpaper, faded into soft shades of sage and cream, carried tiny floral patterns that had almost disappeared with time. A cool scent of lavender drifted faintly through the corridor, so delicate that Margaret could not decide whether it still lingered in the old linen cupboards or merely existed now as memory held inside the walls. The back room faced east across a small orchard where apple trees stood nearly bare beneath the rain. Unlike the workshop below, this room contained almost nothing intended for business. A narrow iron bed stood neatly made beneath a patchwork quilt whose colors had softened through decades of careful washing. Beside the window rested a simple oak writing desk, polished smooth around its edges by years of faithful use. A bookshelf held volumes of poetry, devotional writings, several novels by Miss Austen and Mrs. Gaskell, collections of sermons, botanical guides, and a worn copy of Shakespeare whose pages had loosened from constant reading. Everything suggested a life remarkable, not for excitement, but for extraordinary consistency. Nothing appeared luxurious. Nothing appeared neglected. Every object seemed to have remained because Agnes had found it useful or beautiful enough to deserve another day. Margaret approached the writing desk. Its surface held only an inkstand, a blotter, several sharpened pencils tied together with ribbon, and a small china vase in which rested a single dried sprig of lavender. She gently opened the top drawer. Inside lay folded spectacles, sealing wax, unused stationery, and several bundles of correspondence carefully arranged according to year. Beneath them rested a stack of notebooks bound in faded green cloth. There were nearly 20 of them. Each spine bore only a single date: 1868, 1871, 1875, 1880. The final volume simply read 1894. Margaret lifted the earliest notebook with something approaching hesitation. She had no wish to intrude upon private griefs or hidden confessions, yet Agnes herself had chosen Margaret to inherit the shop. If answers had been left anywhere, surely they had been left here intentionally. She opened the first pages. To her surprise, they contained no reflections, no descriptions of daily life, no intimate thoughts, only dates, weather, and names. November 12th, heavy frost before dawn. Samuel Turner, coat delivered before church. December 3rd, snow throughout the afternoon. Hannah Price, sleeves lengthened before Christmas. January 6th, river frozen. Thomas Green recovered from fever. Coat still fits. Margaret turned another page. The pattern continued. Always the weather first, then the child. Sometimes a brief note, never more than a sentence. There were no complaints about long working days, no mention of loneliness, no account of village gossip, no record of personal triumphs or disappointments. Only children, always children. Notebook after notebook repeated the same quiet rhythm, each winter carefully preserved through names that meant nothing to Margaret but had evidently meant everything to Agnes. Hours passed unnoticed. Outside, The rain gradually faded into mist, while pale afternoon light entered the room with increasing softness. Margaret continued reading year after year, until, somewhere within a notebook dated 1847, several loose sheets slipped gently from between the pages and drifted onto the floor. They were not letters, they were newspaper clippings. The paper had yellowed so deeply with age that it seemed almost the color of old linen. One headline immediately caught her attention: "Severe winter claims children throughout the north." Another reported outbreaks of illness in Yorkshire villages, where families, unable to afford sufficient fuel or warm clothing, had lost young children during one of the harshest winters in living memory. Margaret sat very still. Carefully, she unfolded another clipping. It described school attendance falling dramatically because children possessed no suitable coats for walking through deep snow. Several teachers wrote that pupils simply disappeared from lessons until spring, not from unwillingness to learn, but because their parents dared not send them into freezing weather with threadbare clothing. Between those newspaper fragments lay a single handwritten page. Unlike the brief notes filling every other notebook, this page contained several complete paragraphs. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Agnes, though it appeared younger, firmer, touched by an urgency Margaret had not encountered elsewhere. She began to read. "Today I buried another little girl whose hands had never once been warmed by proper gloves. The rector says we must accept that harsh winters belong to God's world as surely as gentle summers do. I believe him, yet I cannot persuade myself that cold alone buried her. It was not winter that failed her. It was adults who believed another family would help. It was neighbors who assumed someone else had already noticed. It was all the little hesitations from respectable people that finally became one child's grave." Margaret lowered the page slowly. Rainwater continued dripping from the orchard trees outside. Somewhere below, the grandfather clock struck 4 with its familiar calm. She read on. "If Providence grants me enough years, Ashcombe shall never bury another child, because warm cloth cost more than small kindness. I cannot prevent snow, I cannot command good harvests, but I may yet learn to sow." Nothing more followed. No dramatic vow, no declaration of sacrifice, only the next page, dated several months later, where Agnes resumed her familiar pattern. October, first 6 winter coats completed. Mrs. Ellis remarked that no child should begin school shivering. Remember this. Margaret remained seated beside the window for a very long time. She had expected perhaps a family secret, a hidden inheritance, some remarkable event that explained Agnes's peculiar custom. Instead, she had found something quieter. One winter, one newspaper, one funeral, one decision that had been repeated faithfully for nearly 50 years. It struck her suddenly that every extraordinary tradition probably began in precisely this manner, not with great speeches or public resolutions, but with one ordinary person quietly refusing to accept that the world must always remain exactly as it had been yesterday. As twilight gathered beyond the orchard, Edmund's footsteps sounded gently upon the staircase. He paused at the doorway. "I thought you might be here." Margaret looked up from the notebook still resting open across her lap. "I've been reading." "I know." He entered without hurry and glanced toward the pages. She seldom wrote about herself. "No." Margaret smiled faintly. "She wrote about weather." Edmund chuckled softly. That was because weather explained nearly everything. He walked to the window and looked out over the rain-dark orchard. If she wrote heavy snow, she never needed to add that every child coughed the following week. If she wrote early spring, she knew the orchard would bloom. If she wrote hard frost, she expected another long evening beside the stove, finishing sleeves before morning. Margaret gently closed the notebook. "I thought these were journals. They are. They scarcely mention Agnes. Edmund turned toward her. She never believed she was the important part of the story. The room fell quiet once more. Margaret rested her hand upon the worn green cover. She understood now that these notebooks had never been intended to preserve Agnes's life. They had preserved the lives that had quietly passed through hers. And somewhere among those thousands of names, written beside 50 winters of snow, frost and rain, Margaret sensed that the true history of Fairchild Tailors had only just begun to reveal itself. In the days that followed, Margaret found herself returning often to Agnes's journals, though never for very long at a time. They were not books one hurried through. Like the village itself, they asked only for patience. Each page resembled another. Each winter seemed to echo the last. And yet, little by little, she began to notice the quiet changes that only years could reveal. Children whose names first appeared beside the words "coat delivered" returned a decade later, bringing younger brothers and sisters. Boys became fathers. Girls became mothers. The same family names moved through the notebooks as steadily as the seasons themselves, while Agnes's own handwriting aged almost invisibly around them. It occurred to Margaret that the journals recorded something far greater than garments. They preserved continuity. In Bath, where people arrived and departed with the changing fortunes of universities and professions, such permanence had become increasingly rare. Yet here in Ashcombe, one generation seemed always to be standing gently beside another. The blacksmith's grandson now ordered riding jackets from the same shop where his grandfather had once commissioned work clothes. The baker's daughter, now married, brought her own little boy to be measured for a winter coat beneath the very same ceiling beams. Time, Margaret thought, had not rushed through this village as it had elsewhere. It had settled softly, layer upon layer, until the past remained quietly present in almost everything. One afternoon, while the October sun briefly broke through the clouds after several days of rain, Edmund suggested they carry several heavy bolts of wool down from the attic storeroom before winter deliveries began arriving in earnest. The attic occupied the full length of the building beneath its steep slate roof. The space smelled pleasantly of seasoned timber, cedar shavings, dried lavender, and old cloth that had rested undisturbed through many years. Narrow windows admitted pale ribbons of light across rows of shelves where forgotten dress forms, retired patterns, and carefully wrapped fabric waited beneath linen covers. Outside, Margaret could hear rooks circling above the village elms, while a cool wind stirred the last bronze leaves clinging stubbornly to their branches. Edmund moved more slowly upon the attic stairs than he did elsewhere, not because he lacked strength, Margaret noticed, but because every familiar object seemed to awaken some old recollection that invited a moment's pause. He would occasionally rest one hand upon an empty shelf or smile faintly at a battered wooden crate whose purpose Margaret could not guess. At the far end of the attic stood an old travelling trunk reinforced with iron bands darkened by age. Margaret assumed it belonged to Agnes. "It was yours to open long ago," Edmund said quietly. She knelt beside it and lifted the heavy lid. Inside were not business records, nor family heirlooms, but dozens of carefully folded children's garments. Not new ones, old ones, tiny mittens, scarves, caps, little woolen coats whose sleeves had been lengthened, shortened, and patched so skillfully that each alteration seemed almost invisible. Some still carried names stitched discreetly inside the collars. Others had clearly been worn by several different children before being washed, mended, and folded away once more. Margaret looked up in surprise. "I thought every child received a new coat." "They did. Then why keep these?" Edmund walked over slowly and lifted one small brown coat from the trunk. Its elbows had been reinforced with matching cloth, and one cuff bore such delicate repairs that Margaret had to search carefully before finding them. "Because children grow," he said. He brushed his hand gently across the sleeve. "And good wool outlives childhood." Margaret smiled. "So these were passed on, when they could be." He nodded toward the window, where sunlight now touched the village roofs below. Miss Fairchild believed there was no shame in inheriting warmth. The sentence lingered pleasantly between them. Margaret continued, examining the garments, until she noticed something unexpected. Nearly every coat bore tiny repairs. Always neat, always patient, never hurried. It was as though someone had loved every garment enough to extend its life by another season. She turned toward Edmund. "You mended all these?" For the first time since she had known him, the old tailor looked genuinely embarrassed. A few, he smiled. "Most of them." Margaret studied him quietly. There was a silence, unlike the comfortable pauses they had shared before. This one carried something waiting beneath it. "You've worked here nearly 50 years. 48. You must have known Miss Fairchild almost all your life." Edmund rested the little brown coat across his forearm before answering. "Almost." Margaret waited. She had learned that Edmund never resisted questions. He simply answered them when their proper time arrived. At length he spoke. "My father died before I could remember him." His voice remained calm, almost conversational. "My mother took in laundry until illness prevented even that. During the winter of 1856, we lived in 2 rooms behind the old mill. The windows rattled whenever the wind came across the fields, and no matter how much coal Mother tried to save, the fire never seemed to warm more than one corner of the room." Margaret listened without interruption. "I was 7 when my mother stitched patches onto the same coat for the 4th winter. By then the sleeves reached only halfway down my forearms." He smiled faintly, though not with amusement. "I remember believing that was simply how winter felt. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the attic windows. Somewhere below them, the church bell announced the quarter hour. One morning I walked past this shop." Edmund looked toward the staircase, leading down into the workshop where he had spent nearly all his life. "Miss Fairchild happened to see me, standing outside." He paused. "I thought she wished me to move along. Instead, she invited him inside." The workshop had smelled, he remembered, exactly as it still did now. Warm wool, fresh cedar, beeswax and tea. Agnes had knelt before him, measured his shoulders, asked his name only after she had finished, and disappeared into the rear room. 2 days later, she returned, carrying a dark green winter coat. "My first proper coat." He laughed softly beneath his breath. "I thought gentlemen were supposed to wear coats like that." Margaret could picture it. The small orphan, the quiet workshop, Agnes fastening the buttons beneath his chin. "Did your mother pay?" Edmund shook his head. "No." "Did she know?" "She knew enough." He looked thoughtfully at the tiny coat still resting in his hands. "Mother cried after we left." Another silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, simply respectful. Margaret found herself imagining the countless winters that had followed. The little boy had grown, returned to thank Agnes, learned to thread a needle, to cut cloth, to measure shoulders, to repair elbows worn thin by childhood games. Eventually, he had become the quiet old tailor standing beside her now. "Is that why she took you as her apprentice?" Margaret asked gently. Edmund smiled. No. I asked her that once, and?" His eyes brightened with the memory. "She told me she had not chosen me because I owed her gratitude." He looked directly at Margaret. "Gratitude fades," she said. "Warm hands remember longer." Margaret felt the words settle somewhere unexpectedly deep within her. Edmund continued. She said that any child who had once been kept warm through another person's kindness would understand, without needing to be taught, why no other child should be left shivering. He carefully folded the little brown coat and returned it to the trunk. I became her apprentice because she believed that one warm winter ought naturally to become another. Margaret stood looking into the trunk once more. She no longer saw discarded garments. She saw continuity, a chain of quiet mercies stretching across decades. Agnes had not merely clothed children. She had shaped adults who remained in Ashcombe, who became blacksmiths, bakers, schoolteachers, farmers, and perhaps, Margaret now realized, customers who unknowingly paid a little extra upon their invoices because somewhere in childhood they had already learned that warmth could arrive without humiliation. She suddenly understood something Agnes had never written in her journals. The tailoring shop had never been attempting simply to protect children from the cold. It had been protecting something colder still, the loneliness that comes from believing one must endure hardship unseen. As they carried the heavy bolts of wool downstairs together, the afternoon light had begun to soften toward evening. Golden sunlight rested upon the workshop floor, illuminating the shelves where cloth waited to become coats for another winter yet to arrive. Margaret glanced toward Edmund. "You once told me the children's coats had been paid for a long time ago." "I did. I think I understand a little better now." Edmund smiled without looking up from the bundle he carried. "They were paid for in many ways, Mrs. Ellison." He paused beside the cutting table, where generations of cloth had been measured with unwavering patience, some with pennies, some with wool, and some, his weathered hand rested gently upon the polished oak, with the memory of what it feels like to be warm when you expected only cold. By the beginning of November, Ashcombe had settled into that quiet season which belongs neither entirely to autumn nor yet to winter. The leaves that had blazed with copper and gold only a fortnight earlier now lay scattered across the village lanes, pressed dark against the damp cobblestones after several nights of gentle rain. The hedgerows stood nearly bare, revealing stone walls that had been hidden all summer beneath hawthorn and blackberry vines, while each morning the fields surrounding the village awoke beneath a veil of white mist that lingered until the church clock announced 10. Inside Fairchild Tailors, preparations for winter quietly gathered momentum. Lengths of heavy Yorkshire wool arrived almost every Tuesday by cart from the station. Edmund inspected every bolt beneath the window before shelving it, rubbing the cloth lightly between his fingers as though greeting an old acquaintance. Buttons of polished horn were sorted into glass jars. Fresh skeins of silk thread were placed inside cedar drawers where moths could never reach them. Patterns for children's coats, which had rested untouched through the warmer months, gradually reappeared upon the cutting table until they occupied almost as much space as the commissions for gentlemen's overcoats. Margaret had begun helping wherever she could. Although her stitches remained slow compared with Edmund's effortless precision, she proved remarkably patient at simpler tasks. She learned to brush finished garments with soft horsehair, to wrap completed commissions in brown paper tied neatly with cotton string, and to write receipts in the elegant copperplate hand that years of assisting Arthur with university correspondence had made almost second nature. It was while copying several invoices one quiet afternoon that she noticed something she could not believe she had overlooked before. Every completed account followed almost exactly the same arrangement: customer's name, description of garment, measurements, cost of materials, labor, total due. Yet beneath the final figure, printed in remarkably small handwriting along the lower margin, appeared one additional line: Winter Allowance. The amount varied, sometimes only 1 penny, occasionally 3, never more than 6pence. So insignificant beside the total cost of a gentleman's tailored coat, that Margaret understood at once why no customer had ever questioned it. She frowned. She reached for another invoice. Again. Winter Allowance. Then another, and another. The same words appeared beneath every bill she examined. Wedding dresses, waistcoats, school uniforms, ladies' walking cloaks. Even simple alterations, costing only a few shillings, carried the same unobtrusive notation. Margaret laid the invoices across the cutting table until nearly a dozen surrounded her. Every one contained it, always in Agnes's unmistakable handwriting, always placed discreetly enough that it blended almost invisibly among the ordinary calculations. She called quietly across the workshop. "Mr. Reeves." Edmund looked up from pressing the sleeve of a riding jacket. "Yes?" She held up one of the invoices. "What did customers believe this was?" He smiled immediately, as though recognizing an old acquaintance. "The Winter Allowance." "Yes." "What do you think they believed?" Margaret studied the page again. "I should probably assume it was a tax." Most did. Or perhaps a delivery charge. Some thought so. She smiled, despite herself. "And no one ever asked?" "Very few." He crossed the room, wiping a trace of Tailor's chalk from his fingertips before taking the invoice gently from her hands. "You must remember, Mrs. Ellison." He rested the paper beneath the afternoon light. "In villages, people become accustomed to seeing certain things." He tapped the tiny line with one finger. "They stop reading them." Margaret laughed softly. "It seems extraordinary." "It is ordinary." He returned the invoice. "That is why it worked." She looked again at the almost invisible words. The ink had faded slightly after so many years, yet Agnes had written them with unwavering consistency. Not once forgotten, not once omitted. What if someone had objected? Edmund considered the question. "I believe Miss Fairchild would have removed it." "You mean immediately?" "Immediately." Margaret seemed surprised. "So there was never any compulsion?" "None. But no one refused." The old tailor smiled. "One gentleman did." Margaret looked up with interest. "Oh?" "Many years ago." He resumed folding the riding jacket while speaking. "He noticed the extra penny and insisted it be removed because he believed the account inaccurate." "What happened?" "Miss Fairchild apologized." "And removed it?" "She did." Margaret waited. "Then?" "The following Christmas," Edmund continued, "his wife quietly returned to purchase gloves. She asked Miss Fairchild whether the winter allowance could be restored." Margaret smiled. "She knew?" "I believe she always knew." Outside the shop, laughter drifted faintly from a group of schoolchildren hurrying home before dusk. Their boots splashed through shallow puddles, while scarves fluttered behind them in the growing wind. Margaret watched them disappear past the bakery window. "I wonder whether anyone ever realized." "They realized enough." "What do you mean?" Edmund walked toward one of the older cabinets and opened a shallow drawer. Inside lay several invoices, dating back nearly 40 years. He selected one. "Read the customer's name." Margaret did. "Mrs. Eleanor Briggs. And now read Agnes's journal for that same winter." Margaret crossed to the shelf where she had left the notebooks. After several minutes, she found the correct volume. There, among the familiar entries recording frost, snowfall, and children's names, appeared another brief note. Mrs. Briggs sent blackberry preserves again. Pretended they were payment for mending. Allowed her the pretense. Margaret paused. She smiled slowly. It wasn't only money. No, the villagers knew in their own way. They knew enough not to embarrass one another. Margaret continued reading. Another note. Mr. Carter insisted on paying twice for his hunting coat. Returned once. Accepted second payment without discussion. Another. Mrs. Lewis left wool by the back door before dawn. Never mentioned it. Neither shall I. Margaret closed the journal very gently. A new understanding began quietly arranging itself inside her mind. She had imagined Agnes alone, carrying this secret for 50 years. That had not been entirely true. The village had carried it with her, not openly, never through meetings or announcements, but through hundreds of tiny gestures so modest that each remained almost invisible by itself. One woman left preserves, another farmer delivered firewood, someone rounded up an invoice, someone else forgot to collect change. Each act small enough to preserve dignity, large enough, when gathered together across decades, to warm every child in Ashcombe. The realization filled Margaret with an emotion she found difficult to name. It was admiration, certainly. But there was something else, humility. She had arrived believing herself the educated woman, accustomed to lectures, books, and carefully reasoned principles. Yet this little village, whose people rarely spoke about virtue at all, had quietly practiced it for half a century with remarkable sophistication. Not one person had claimed credit. Not one plaque commemorated the custom. No sermon praised it. No newspaper recorded it. The kindness had survived precisely because it remained almost too ordinary to notice. As evening settled outside, Edmund lit the workshop lamps one by one. Their warm glow reflected upon the polished scissors, the brass thimbles, and rows of folded cloth, waiting for winter hands to shape them into coats. Margaret picked up one final invoice. Her fingers traced the tiny words at the bottom. Winter Allowance. So small, almost invisible. She thought of all the customers who had glanced over that line without reading it. How many times had she herself done the same in life? How often had she hurried past little acts of generosity because they lacked the grandeur she imagined goodness ought to possess? The paper trembled slightly as she folded it closed. She understood now why the secret had endured for so many years. It had never hidden itself. It had simply trusted that most people look only at the largest figures on a page. Meanwhile, somewhere near the bottom, in handwriting scarcely larger than a whisper, kindness had been quietly balancing the accounts all along. The first hard frost arrived during the second week of November. Margaret noticed it before she had even opened the curtains. The window panes of the small apartment above the shop had become delicate canvases of silver fern-like crystals, each one spreading across the glass with astonishing intricacy, as though winter itself had spent the night quietly sketching upon them. Beyond the blurred patterns, Ashcombe lay wrapped in a pale blue stillness. Chimneys had begun smoking long before sunrise, their thin columns drifting lazily above the rooftops before disappearing into the cold morning sky. The bare branches of the elm trees lining the village green stood perfectly motionless, while every rooftop, every stone wall, and every hedge carried a thin dusting of white that glowed softly beneath the first light of dawn. The village had entered the season for which Fairchild Tailors had spent the entire autumn preparing. Throughout the morning, the workshop grew steadily busier. Mothers arrived carrying children's measurements folded neatly inside handbags. Fathers stopped on their way to the fields to collect repaired coats before the weather worsened. The front bell rang so frequently that its cheerful chime blended naturally with the ticking of the grandfather clock, the steady rhythm of Edmund's scissors, and the gentle crackling of the coal fire that now burned from dawn until evening. Margaret had begun to feel less like a visitor. She knew where every spool of thread belonged, which shelves held winter flannel, and how Edmund preferred finished garments to be folded before wrapping. Customers no longer greeted her with cautious curiosity. They addressed her simply as Mrs. Ellison, asked after her health, brought her jars of blackberry preserve or freshly baked scones, and spoke as though she had quietly become part of the familiar life of the village. Yet beneath that growing sense of belonging, another feeling refused to leave her. It returned whenever she copied another invoice. Whenever she saw the almost invisible words Winter Allowance resting quietly beneath the total, whenever she remembered the hidden notebook inside Agnes's drawer, the custom had revealed itself to be generous. It had also revealed itself to be secret. Margaret could not persuade herself that those two things ought necessarily to remain together. Late one afternoon, after the last customer had departed and darkness settled gently beyond the windows, she remained seated beside the stove, with several account books spread across her lap. Edmund was repairing the cuff of an old military coat beneath the nearest lamp. For some time neither of them spoke. Outside, someone crossed High Street, pulling a handcart whose wooden wheels creaked softly over the frozen cobblestones before disappearing into the quiet. At last, Margaret closed the ledger. "Mr. Reeves." He looked up immediately. "Yes, Mrs. Ellison? I have been thinking. I rather suspected you had." She smiled faintly. "It is about the winter allowance." Edmund laid aside his needle. "I wondered when we should speak of it." Margaret rose slowly and crossed toward the front window. The glass reflected both the warm workshop behind her and the cold darkness outside, so that for a moment she seemed to stand between two different worlds. "I understand now why Agnes created it. Do you?" "I believe so." She folded her hands before her. "I understand the kindness." She hesitated. "But I am less certain about the secrecy." Edmund remained silent. Margaret turned to face him. "If the village wishes to keep children warm, why not simply say so?" The old tailor listened without interruption. "We could establish a proper winter fund." She spoke gently now, almost as though arranging her thoughts while hearing them aloud for the first time. "There could be a collection each autumn. The rector could announce it after Sunday service. The schoolmaster might explain its purpose. The accounts would be entirely open. Every contribution recorded honestly." She smiled, encouraged by the increasing order of the idea. People would know exactly where their money had gone. For several moments, Edmund said nothing. He merely regarded the glowing coals inside the stove. When he finally spoke, his voice remained as calm as ever. "It is a sensible plan." Margaret felt unexpectedly relieved. "You think so?" "I think it is perfectly sensible." Something in his tone caused her to pause. "But," he looked toward the shelves, where rows of completed children's coats already waited for collection. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "When the collection begins," he chose his words carefully, "who will give first?" Margaret considered. "I imagine many people. And if someone gives nothing," she frowned slightly, "they would not be obliged." "No," he nodded. "They would not." He threaded another needle. "And if a widow believes her sixpence too small beside the grocer's half-crown?" Margaret opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. "And if the blacksmith gives generously 1 year, but poorly the next, because business has been difficult?" He continued quietly. "Will he feel ashamed?" Margaret said nothing. "And if the richest family contributes less than everyone expected?" Edmund smiled sadly. "Will the village remember only their generosity, or also their reluctance?" The workshop had grown remarkably still. Only the fire disturbed the silence, settling softly within the grate. Margaret looked again toward the rows of finished coats. She suddenly imagined the children themselves. Would they know? Would they understand that their coats had been bought by public charity? Would they begin thanking certain neighbors while avoiding the eyes of others? Would their parents feel gratitude or obligation? Edmund seemed almost to hear the questions forming within her. "Miss Fairchild once told me something I never forgot." He placed the military coat carefully upon the table. "The moment kindness begins counting itself," she said, "it also begins counting those who received it." Margaret lowered her eyes. The sentence struck her with uncomfortable precision. She had spent much of her life believing transparency solved nearly every moral difficulty. Now she wondered whether there existed rare occasions when complete openness altered the very nature of the gift itself. Still, the uneasiness remained. She crossed slowly toward the cutting table and rested one hand upon its polished surface. I cannot help feeling that people ought to know. I know. It troubles me. I know. They are paying for something without realizing it. Edmund nodded. I understand. His agreement surprised her. You do? I have asked myself the same question. You have, many times. Margaret looked at him carefully. You never wished to change it. The old tailor smiled with quiet melancholy. More than once. And why didn't you? He walked to the shelf where Agnes's journals stood in a neat row. Without opening them, he rested his fingertips lightly upon their worn green bindings. Because every time I thought I had found a better way, his gaze drifted toward the children's coats waiting patiently beside the wall. Winter arrived. The words carried no argument, only experience. Margaret understood what he meant. Good intentions belonged easily to autumn. They were simple, while discussed beside warm fires, with ledgers open upon the table. Winter was less patient. Winter asked not for theories, but for coats, not eventually, not after committees and collections and announcements, before the first snowfall. She remained thoughtful for the rest of the evening. Yet her conscience would not release the matter entirely. When she finally extinguished the lamps before climbing upstairs, she paused one last time beside the account books. Her decision, once made, came quietly. She would try, only once, not because she doubted Agnes, nor because she distrusted Edmund, but because she believed kindness should be able to survive the light as well as the shadows. If a better way truly existed, she owed it to the future of Fairchild Tailors to discover it. Above her, the frost had already begun forming again upon the upstairs windows. Below, resting unnoticed inside every unfinished invoice, the small printed words, Winter Allowance, waited silently, unaware that for the first time in more than 50 years, someone had resolved that before another winter ended, they might disappear forever. Margaret did not act immediately. For several days she carried her decision quietly within herself, allowing it to settle before giving it shape. She had no wish to dismantle a tradition that had survived half a century merely because it seemed unusual to an outsider, nor did she wish to disregard Edmund's experience, earned through nearly 50 winters spent beside Agnes. Yet the conviction remained. Kindness, she believed, ought never depend upon concealment. If the people of Ashcombe truly possessed the generous hearts Edmund claimed, surely they would continue giving once they understood exactly whom they were helping. The opportunity arrived sooner than she expected. On the first Monday of November, after the church bells had finished ringing for morning prayers, Margaret walked across the village green, carrying a neat bundle of papers tied with blue ribbon. The air possessed that clean, almost crystalline sharpness which belongs only to the earliest days of winter. Every footstep upon the frosted grass produced a delicate crunch, while the bare branches overhead held dozens of small birds puffed into round shapes against the cold. The Reverend Samuel Collins welcomed her warmly into the rectory. The room where they sat overlooked the churchyard, where ancient yew trees cast long shadows across weathered gravestones dusted with frost. A kettle simmered quietly upon the hearth, filling the room with the comforting fragrance of tea and burning oak logs. Margaret explained her proposal with careful thought. She suggested establishing a winter coat fund, entirely public and entirely voluntary. Every household would know exactly how much had been collected. Every expenditure would be recorded openly. At the end of each season, the accounts could be displayed upon the church notice board so that every contributor might see how many children had received warm coats through the kindness of the village. The Reverend listened thoughtfully. "It is an admirable idea, Mrs. Ellison." "I hope so. It is certainly an honest one." She smiled. "That was my intention." Within a week, the notices appeared. One hung outside the church, another beside the bakery, a third in the post office. The village schoolmaster announced the appeal after lessons, while Reverend Collins mentioned it briefly following Sunday service. The wording remained simple. This winter, Fairchild Tailors invites the people of Ashcombe to contribute openly toward warm coats for every child in the parish. Every gift, large or small, will be received with gratitude. Margaret felt quietly hopeful. The first day, several envelopes arrived. Mrs. Pennington contributed 5 shillings. The blacksmith left half a crown upon the counter before hurrying back to his forge. The baker's wife brought a basket of fresh bread together with a small purse containing 12 pennies. Margaret carefully entered every donation into a new ledger. For the first time, the accounts were beautifully transparent. Each contribution bore a name, each expense was recorded. Everything balanced exactly as she believed proper accounts ought to. She showed the ledger to Edmund that evening. He studied it kindly. "It is beautifully kept. You think so?" "I do." He closed the book gently. "It reminds me of your husband." Margaret laughed softly. "He would have approved. I believe he would." The first week passed encouragingly. More gifts arrived, some generous, others modest. Margaret began calculating confidently. There would be enough. Surely there would be enough. Yet as November deepened, something curious began to happen. The envelopes arrived less often. People continued entering the shop exactly as before. They chatted warmly, ordered coats, collected repairs, asked after Margaret's health, praised the idea whenever it arose in conversation. What a splendid scheme. A wonderful thing for the village. Someone ought certainly to support it. Many promised to contribute after market day. Others said they would remember before Christmas. Some explained that this season had been unexpectedly expensive, but next year they hoped to give much more. Margaret believed every word. The promises were sincere. Only the money did not arrive. One damp Wednesday evening, she remained alone in the workshop after Edmund had gone to lock the rear gate. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows, while wind carried fallen leaves along High Street in slow swirling circles beneath the gas lamps. She opened the donation ledger, then Agnes's old allowance notebook, then her own calculations for the children's coats. She counted again and again. The figures had changed, not dramatically, only enough that she understood immediately. There would not be sufficient funds, not unless something altered. She recalculated twice more, convinced she had misplaced a column. The answer remained stubbornly unchanged. Nearly 1/3 of the winter coats still lacked funding. Margaret sat motionless. The workshop seemed unusually quiet that evening. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock sounded slower than before. She remembered the first week after announcing the appeal. How hopeful everyone had seemed. How warmly they had praised the idea. No one had opposed it. No one had criticized it. Yet somehow, the quiet current of generosity that had flowed almost unnoticed through the village for 50 years had begun to hesitate. The following afternoon confirmed her fears. Mrs. Ellis entered carrying measurements for her youngest grandson. As Margaret finished writing the order, the elderly woman glanced toward the notice about the winter coat fund displayed neatly upon the counter. "I've been meaning to contribute," she said apologetically. "I'm sure you have. I thought perhaps Mr. Fletcher already had." She smiled awkwardly. "He's always generous." Margaret smiled in return. "I'm certain he is." After Mrs. Ellis departed, another customer arrived, then another. Each conversation sounded strangely familiar. "I imagine the collection must already be doing well. There are so many people in the village. I dare say my little contribution would hardly matter. I shall certainly remember before Christmas." None of these people lacked kindness. Margaret knew that now. Many of them had probably, for years, paid Agnes's quiet winter allowance without the slightest hesitation. Yet once generosity had become visible, once it could be measured, compared, observed, something delicate had changed. People no longer gave naturally. They began thinking first, calculating, wondering whether someone wealthier might contribute more, whether their own gift appeared too small, whether today or next week might be the better moment. Each hesitation lasted only seconds, yet hundreds of tiny hesitations, Margaret suddenly realized, could become as powerful as a refusal. That evening, she remained in the shop long after darkness had settled over Ashcombe. The finished children's coats hung in careful rows along the rear wall, waiting patiently for the families who would soon collect them. Margaret counted them, then counted the unfinished orders, still pinned neatly to the workboard. Too many. Far too many. She felt no anger, only a quiet sadness she had not expected. Edmund entered, carrying another armful of folded cloth. He looked once at the open ledgers upon the table, then at Margaret. "You've reached the same page Miss Fairchild reached." Margaret lowered her eyes. "I thought honesty would make generosity stronger." "So did I." She looked up in surprise. "You?" He nodded gently. "I suggested something very similar. When? 30 years ago." Margaret stared at him, and Agnes, a smile, full of affection and memory, crossed the old tailor's face. "She thanked me. And then?" She asked only one question. "What was it?" Edmund looked toward the waiting children's coats. "When the snow arrives," she said, "shall we have time to teach the village how to give differently?" Silence settled once more. Margaret understood. Customs built across 50 years could disappear in one winter. They could not always be rebuilt before the first frost. Outside, snow began falling, only lightly at first. Tiny white flakes drifted beneath the gas lamps, dissolving almost immediately upon the wet cobblestones, before quietly covering them, one layer at a time. Margaret walked to the front window. Children would wake tomorrow, delighted by the season's first snowfall. Somewhere among them were boys and girls still waiting for coats not yet funded. She rested one hand against the cool glass. For the first time since arriving in Ashcombe, she understood with painful clarity that Agnes had never hidden the truth because she distrusted people. She had hidden the mechanism because she understood something far more fragile than money. Goodness, left to flow naturally, often reached farther than goodness asked to announce itself. Standing there, watching the first snow settle silently over the sleeping village, Margaret finally understood the meaning of the sentence Agnes had written months before her death. "Please do not change the first winter." It had never been a request to preserve an old habit. It had been a plea to protect the invisible thread that had quietly stitched an entire village together for more than 50 years. The snowfall continued throughout the night. When Margaret awoke the following morning, Ashcombe had become almost unrecognizable beneath its quiet white covering. Every roof along High Street wore a soft blanket of snow. Chimney pots rose like dark silhouettes from fields of white, and the familiar cobblestones had disappeared beneath an untouched layer that reflected the pale winter sun with almost painful brightness. The village seemed quieter than ever before, as though even ordinary sounds had become muffled beneath the fresh snow. She stood for several minutes at the bedroom window, watching smoke rise slowly from cottage chimneys into the cold blue sky. Children would soon leave their houses. Some would stop to throw the season's first snowball. Some would hurry toward school, laughing as their boots disappeared into the drifts. And some, Margaret thought of the unfinished coats waiting downstairs. The thought remained with her as she descended into the workshop. Edmund had already arrived. He was feeding fresh coal into the stove, and the familiar warmth was gradually returning to the room. Outside, customers' footprints began appearing across the snow-covered pavement, one careful step after another. each set of tracks briefly distinct before fresh flakes softened their edges again. Neither of them mentioned the failed collection. They worked almost silently through the morning. Margaret wrapped completed garments. Edmund finished buttonholes. The grandfather clock marked each passing hour with its familiar calm. Yet beneath the quiet industry of the workshop lingered an unmistakable feeling that something remained unfinished. Not merely the coats themselves, but the conversation Agnes had begun long before either of them had spoken aloud. Shortly after luncheon, Edmund approached the old cutting table. He rested one weathered hand upon its polished edge for a moment before looking at Margaret. "There is one place you haven't searched." She looked up. "I thought I'd opened every drawer." "You have. Every cupboard." "Yes. Then what remains?" Edmund glanced toward the narrow staircase leading upstairs. "The writing desk." Margaret frowned gently. "I've already found the journals. There is another compartment." She stared at him in surprise. "You knew?" "I knew it existed. You never opened it." He smiled faintly. "It wasn't left for me." They climbed together to Agnes's room. The winter light, entering through the east-facing window, possessed a remarkable clarity after the snowfall, illuminating every familiar object with quiet precision. The dried lavender upon the desk cast a delicate shadow across the polished wood, while beyond the glass, the orchard stood entirely white, each bare branch outlined with snow, like ink upon paper. Edmund knelt beside the writing desk. His fingers moved confidently beneath its lowest drawer until they found a hidden wooden catch, almost invisible beneath the frame. A soft click echoed through the quiet room. The back panel slid forward. Inside lay only one object, a single envelope, cream-colored, sealed with dark green wax. Across its front, written in Agnes Fairchild's unmistakable hand, appeared only 2 words: "For Margaret." Neither of them spoke. Margaret held the envelope for several moments before carefully breaking the seal. The paper inside crackled softly as she unfolded it. Unlike the brief notes in Agnes's journals, this letter filled several pages. The handwriting remained steady, despite Agnes's advancing age. Margaret began to read. "My dear Mrs. Ellison, if you are reading these pages, then I have already gone where no winter can trouble old bones any longer. Forgive an old woman for arranging one final conversation after her departure. I have never possessed much talent for farewells spoken aloud. They are too easily interrupted by tears, and tears seldom improve one's judgment." Margaret smiled despite herself. The opening carried precisely the gentle wit she had begun imagining in Agnes, though the journals had rarely revealed it. She continued, "You are perhaps wondering why a woman you scarcely remember has entrusted you with an entire shop. The solicitor will have told you we are relations, which is true enough, though family alone has never persuaded me that one soul ought naturally to inherit another's work. Blood may pass through generations by providence, purpose does not." Margaret lowered the page. The room seemed remarkably still. Even the branches outside appeared to have stopped moving. She read on. "Nearly 25 years ago, a letter reached this shop by mistake. It had been intended for a school in Bath, yet Providence has always managed addresses better than the Royal Mail. The letter came from the mother of a little boy. She wished to thank a certain schoolmistress who had quietly purchased a new winter coat after discovering that the child had spent several mornings pretending illness because he possessed nothing warm enough for the walk to school." Margaret's breath caught. She remembered. The memory returned with astonishing clarity, not because she had considered it especially important, precisely because she had not. A boy named Daniel, his father injured, his mother taking in washing. The coat had cost nearly half a month's salary. She had never mentioned it again. The letter continued. The grateful mother addressed her thanks carelessly. Instead of the school, she wrote only, To the lady who keeps children warm, the postmaster, who knew both my trade and your kindness, believed the letter belonged here. Margaret felt tears gathering unexpectedly. Not dramatic tears, only the quiet kind that arrive when one discovers that something forgotten has continued living somewhere beyond memory. I attempted to return the letter. Instead, I found myself reading it several times. I decided that any woman who could spend her own wages upon one child, speak of it to no one, and continue her life as though nothing remarkable had occurred, already understood the only qualification this shop truly requires. Margaret lowered the page again. Outside, a pair of children hurried laughing across the snowy orchard, their scarves fluttering behind them, like bright ribbons against the white landscape. She had never known. All those years, Agnes had known. She continued reading. You imagine that I have left you a tailoring business. That is the smallest part of your inheritance. I leave you a question. Can kindness remain beautiful after it becomes visible? Perhaps you will answer differently than I did. Perhaps you will discover a wiser method than mine. If so, I hope with all my heart you choose it. Traditions deserve loyalty only while they continue serving love better than pride. Margaret stopped. Her eyes lingered upon those words. There was no command, no insistence that she preserve the custom forever, only trust. Agnes had expected her to think independently, to test, to question. The letter concluded. If, however, your first attempt should fail, do not mistake failure for foolishness. Every generation must learn again why certain old paths remain beneath our feet. Do not keep my customs because they were mine. Keep only whatever still keeps children warm. Everything else may safely disappear. With affection from one woman who happened to sew to another who happened to teach, Agnes Fairchild. The room remained silent long after Margaret folded the letter. Snow continued drifting gently beyond the window. Neither she nor Edmund spoke for several minutes. Finally, she whispered, "She knew." Edmund nodded. She always knew. She knew I might try to change everything. Yes, and she wasn't angry. No. Margaret looked again at the final page. She expected it. Edmund smiled gently. Miss Fairchild trusted experience more than instruction. Margaret laughed quietly through the tears she had not attempted to hide. She trusted Winter. She did. She crossed slowly toward the window, overlooking the village. Below, the first families had already begun walking toward Fairchild Tailors to collect the children's coats, finished only days before. Small figures moved across the white street, tiny boots, scarves, red cheeks bright from the cold. Margaret held Agnes's letter against her chest. At last she understood that Agnes had not chosen her because she would obey. She had chosen her because she believed Margaret possessed the courage to question, the humility to learn from failure, and, above all, the quiet heart to place children before her own certainty. Only then did Margaret truly realize what had been entrusted to her. It was not a shop. It was not a tradition. It was the responsibility of ensuring that, no matter how many winters Ashcombe might yet endure, no child would ever again stand outside a tailor's window believing warmth belonged only to someone else. The letter remained folded inside Margaret's apron pocket for the rest of the day. She did not read it again. She found she no longer needed to. Agnes's words had already settled quietly within her, not as instructions demanding obedience, but as the gentle voice of an older friend who understood that wisdom could never simply be inherited. It had to be discovered, sometimes through success, and sometimes through the quiet disappointment of believing one had found a better path. Outside, the snow continued falling with remarkable patience. It did not hurry, nor did it become heavier. Each flake seemed content to join the countless others already resting upon rooftops, hedges, stone walls, and the bare branches of the orchard behind the house. Ashcombe had become softer beneath its white covering. Even the familiar sounds of village life, the creaking wheels of carts, the distant barking of dogs, the laughter of school children crossing the green, reached the workshop as though wrapped carefully in layers of wool. Inside Fairchild Tailors, however, the day grew steadily busier. Families arrived, one after another, to collect the first completed winter coats. Margaret stood beside Edmund as he helped each child into sleeves, still warm from the pressing iron. Buttons were fastened beneath small chins. Collars were adjusted against tiny necks. Sleeves were examined carefully to ensure they reached precisely the right length. The children, as children always do, cared little for mystery. They admired the bright brass buttons. They buried cold hands inside deep pockets. They twirled before their mothers to see how the heavy skirts of the coats moved. One little girl declared that her new coat smelled like warm toast, causing Edmund to laugh so heartily that even Margaret joined him. Watching them, Margaret realized something that no ledger, journal, or letter had ever fully explained. The coats disappeared into ordinary life almost immediately. Within minutes, they ceased being gifts. They became simply my coat, the coat a little boy would wear while walking to school, the coat a little girl would use to carry apples hidden inside its pockets, the coat that would gather snow upon its shoulders, mud around its hem, and perhaps one day be passed to a younger brother or sister. Agnes had never wanted children to remember charity. She had wanted them to remember warmth. Late that afternoon, after the last family had departed and dusk gathered beyond the frosted windows, Margaret climbed once more to the little room above the shop. She carried with her one of the unfinished children's coats. It was made of deep blue wool with a soft grey lining, waiting only for its final inspection before delivery the following morning. She laid it gently across Agnes's old writing desk. Beside it rested the basket containing needles, silk thread, and small scraps of cloth. Margaret searched quietly among them until she found a narrow strip of pale blue wool, scarcely wider than her little finger. It was an unremarkable piece of fabric, too small to become part of any garment, too beautiful to throw away. She threaded a fine needle. Then, with slow concentration born more of care than experience, she stitched the little strip inside the coat, beneath the lining, where no one would ever notice it unless they deliberately searched. Not upon the collar, not upon the sleeve, hidden quietly inside the left front panel, where it rested close to the child's heart. The stitches were tiny, almost invisible. When she finished, she closed the lining so carefully that no trace of her work remained. She smiled to herself. It was not a signature, nor a badge, certainly not a mark of ownership. It was simply a beginning. When she returned downstairs, Edmund was banking the fire for the evening. He looked up as she entered, carrying the completed coat. "You've finished it." "I have." He accepted the garment and examined it with the practiced eye of a master tailor. The seams pleased him. The buttons sat perfectly. The collar lay flat. Then his fingers paused. He had discovered the pale blue strip hidden beneath the lining. He looked toward Margaret without speaking. "I changed one thing," she said quietly. "I can see. I hope you don't mind." Edmund remained silent for several moments. Finally he asked, "Why blue?" Margaret smiled. "I couldn't rightly say." She thought for a moment. Perhaps because winter skies always seem to become blue again after snow. The old tailor nodded thoughtfully. Miss Fairchild would have approved. Margaret laughed softly. "I'm not entirely certain she would. I think she would." He folded the coat carefully. "Not because of the cloth, because you changed only what did not change the child." Those words remained with Margaret long after Edmund had gone home. That evening, she opened a fresh ledger, not the accounts, not the invoices, a plain notebook whose first page remained entirely blank. She dipped her pen into the ink and hesitated. For several moments she simply listened. The clock, the settling fire, the faint whisper of snow brushing against the windows. Then she wrote, Winter of 1894. The first winter without Miss Fairchild. The children shall have their coats. Inside each one, a small piece of blue cloth shall remain unseen. Not so they remember who made it, but so that, if one day they become old enough to warm another child, they may discover that kindness often begins where no one thinks to look. She closed the notebook gently. Outside, the snow had finally stopped. Above the rooftops of Ashcombe, the clouds were beginning to part, revealing a scattering of quiet winter stars that shimmered above the sleeping village. Margaret stood for a long while beside the workshop window. The lights in the cottages gradually disappeared one by one, until only the church lantern and the tailor's own window continued shining across the silent street. Tomorrow morning another child would arrive, another coat would leave the shop, another winter day would quietly begin. Nothing about it would seem extraordinary, and perhaps, Margaret thought, as she extinguished the final lamp, that was precisely how Agnes had always hoped goodness would survive, not through grand gestures remembered by everyone, but through small acts woven so naturally into ordinary life that after many years, no one could quite remember where they had first begun. Some traditions endure because people insist upon preserving them. Others endure because they become indistinguishable from kindness itself. Standing in the darkness of the little tailor's shop, with the scent of wool, cedar, and cooling coal lingering gently in the air, Margaret understood that Fairchild Tailors had never truly been teaching a village how to sew. For more than half a century, it had quietly been teaching generations how to leave the world a little warmer than they had found it. One careful stitch, one unnoticed kindness, and one winter at a time. And so, our story comes quietly to its rest. The lamps inside Fairchild Tailors have been extinguished one by one, leaving only the faint glow of moonlight resting upon the snow outside. The village has grown wonderfully still. Smoke rises lazily from the last few chimneys. The church bell has long since fallen silent, and the little tailor's shop waits peacefully for another winter morning to begin. Margaret has closed the ledger. Edmund has laid down his needle. The children are warm. The village sleeps. Perhaps that is the gentlest ending any story could hope for. Not one in which every question is answered, but one in which every heart has found a little more peace than when the evening first began. Thank you for spending this quiet Victorian evening with me. If this story has brought you a little comfort, I hope you will return another night, when another forgotten village, another warm hearth, or another gentle soul from the 19th century is waiting to share its story with you. Until then, may your own night be peaceful, may your dreams be gentle, and may you always find, somewhere in this wide world, a warm light glowing quietly behind a welcoming window. This is Quiet Victorian Nights, wishing you a very peaceful night and the sweetest of dreams.